They said family always comes first. But what if coming first meant your parents and sister moving into your mountain villa without asking? While they unpacked their boxes, I was on the other side of the country, watching it live on my phone. One tap later, every lock sealed, every lie exposed, and the cops showed up before I did. I'm Clara Monroe, and this is the story of how I locked out my past to protect my peace. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. It was a gray Tuesday morning in Seattle, and the rain hadn't stopped since dawn. I sat near the window of a small cafe on Pier 57, nursing a half-finished cappuccino that had already gone cold. My laptop was open to a rendering of the Aurora Retreat project, a mountain eco-lodge I'd been designing for months, but I wasn't really focused. The steady hum of voices and the smell of espresso gave the illusion of calm. For once, I felt like I had a little control over my life. Then my phone buzzed on the table. A notification from my home security app flashed across the screen. Unrecognized motion detected. Aspen Highlands property. I frowned, tapping the alert. A video feed appeared. My front drive bathed in pale mountain light, and I froze. There was a white rental truck parked at the base of the garage. The back doors were open, movers in gray jumpsuits carrying boxes toward my front steps. And leading them, like a director on a movie set, was my mother, Evelyn, gray hair pulled into her usual bun hands, moving with authority. Behind her, my sister Lauren was on the phone, pointing toward the porch. Two small figures darted past her legs. Owen and Piper, her kids, laughing, climbing the stone railing that I'd designed myself. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My stomach hollowed out. I swiped to another camera angle. My living room. The movers were already inside. My mother's voice carried faintly through the mic. "The linens go upstairs, sweetheart, and those boxes by the fireplace." The sound of my own heartbeat filled my ears. The phone rang. Mrs. Rowan's name appeared on the screen. My elderly neighbor who lived half a mile down the hill. "Clara, honey," she said, her voice trembling. "They're saying this is their house. Your mother told the movers you knew they'd be here. They're unpacking, dear." What should I do? I stared at the live video at my family moving through my space as if it were theirs. My tongue felt thick. "Mrs. Rowan." I managed, "Please don't say anything to them. Just stay inside. I'll handle it." She hesitated. "They're putting boxes in your kitchen." "I see it," I whispered. When the call ended, I sat there motionless, watching my mother open my cabinets. My sister gesture like she owned the place. A strange stillness spread through me. Not anger, not fear. Something colder. Voice over my own mind, whispering, "They always said family was where you're safest. No one ever warned me what happens when family becomes the intruder." I opened the home security app again. The interface showed a map of my villa. Every door, every window, every lock. For years, my family had joked that I was paranoid that my mountain villa was too high-tech. I used to laugh along. Now I was grateful for every sensor, every camera. I selected the command, "Secure all doors." A second later, a soft, mechanical sound came through the speakers. One by one, each lock engaged with a clean, metallic click. The system confirmed all entry points secured. On the screen, Lauren turned toward the door, tugging at the handle. She frowned, pulled harder. My mother shouted something I couldn't hear. The camera mic caught the muffled thud of her palm hitting the wood. "Clara." She called out, her voice sharp, even through the speakers. "Don't be ridiculous. Let us in." I didn't answer. My hand trembled slightly, but not from fear, more like release. The barista behind the counter called refill for Clara. The sound snapped me back to the cafe. A few customers glanced my way, unaware that my life was collapsing in real time. I picked up my phone again, switched to another camera view. My mother was pacing the porch now, talking rapidly into her cell phone. Lauren stood behind her eyes, darting toward the truck. The kids kept playing on the driveway, kicking pine cones into the snowmelt. The scene looked almost domestic, if it weren't for the fact that it was my home they were invading. I felt my jaw tighten. The weight of years, of obligation guilt, and endless emotional blackmail, pressed down on me like a hand to the chest. All the times my mother said family doesn't owe family explanations. All the times I gave in, paid their bills, watched them chip away pieces of me. Not this time. I scrolled to the emergency contact tab, hovering over the number for the local sheriff's office. I didn't press it yet. Instead, I sat back and let the image sink in. My mother had planned this. The moving truck wasn't spontaneous. The timing, while I was away in Seattle, wasn't coincidence. They'd waited for me to leave. They thought I'd be too afraid to fight back. Outside the cafe, the rain grew heavier, blurring the city skyline into streaks of gray. I watched my reflection in the window. Hair slightly messy from travel, eyes tired, but sharper than they'd been in years. I whispered to no one. "You have no idea who you're dealing with anymore." My hand steadied. I tapped to activate the alarm recording feature, saving the footage to the cloud. Then I opened my travel app and booked the next flight back to Denver. Departure tonight. As I confirmed the ticket, thunder rolled over the sound. I looked once more at the phone screen. My family still moving around inside my house, confident, comfortable, entitled. I slid the phone face down on the table, drained the last of my coffee, and stood up. The chair scraped softly against the tile. Outside, the rain hit my coat like 1,000 tiny needles. I didn't pull up my hood. I wanted the cold. It helped me stay clear. The security app vibrated once more in my pocket. A final system message. All doors locked. Perimeter secure. For the first time in years, I actually believed it. And as I walked out into the storm, one thought echoed through my mind, steady and certain I wasn't scared anymore. I was done being their victim. I was going home. The highway stretched ahead like a silver ribbon cutting through the heart of the Rockies. My rental car hummed steadily beneath me, the wipers sweeping away a thin layer of sleet that had started to fall over the windshield. The closer I got to Colorado, the heavier the air felt. Not because of the altitude, but because of what waited for me on that mountain. It had been years since I'd driven this road alone. The last time was when I moved to Aspen Highlands, to start over, to build something that was finally mine. The villa had been my sanctuary, a quiet, modern space overlooking pine trees and the curve of the valley. I had filled it with silence, with design, with peace. Now my family was inside, treating it like a shared inheritance. The monotone of the tires on asphalt lulled me into memory. Boulder, 1998. The house smelled like chalk dust and burned toast, my mother's usual breakfast before heading to teach at the high school. My father, Richard, was already in the garage fixing something that didn't need fixing. Lauren, 3 years older than me, sat at the kitchen table painting her nails instead of studying. Clara. Mom would say, "Don't talk back when I tell you something. Family doesn't argue. Family sticks together." She'd say it like it was a blessing, but it always sounded like a threat. She believed sacrifice made her holy. "I gave up everything for you girls," she'd remind us. "You owe me that much." And Lauren would always nod, her voice sweet obedient. "Of course we do, Mom. I never could. Even as a teenager, I'd see through the guilt that came wrapped as love." I pressed harder on the gas pedal. The road curved, mountains rising on both sides like gray teeth biting the sky. The car's heater made a low hum, but the air inside still felt cold. My hands were tight around the wheel. The truth was, I hadn't really spoken to them in months. Calls from my mother had dwindled to guilt-laced voicemails. Lauren's texts were only about money. Ballet classes, school trips, repairs. It was always something. Last winter at a rare family dinner in Boulder, I'd made the mistake of showing them photos of the villa. It had just been finished. The stone facade, the glass balcony, the way sunlight hit the cedar floors in the morning. Mom's face softened at first. "It's beautiful," she said. Then the look changed, the kind that always came right before she claimed something as hers. "But it's too much space for one person. Lauren and the kids could live there at least part-time." I remembered putting my fork down. "Mom." "That's not how this works," Lauren snorted. "You're not even there half the time. What's the big deal?" "The big deal," I said carefully, "is that it's my house. I worked for it." Mom smiled the way people smile before cutting you down. "Sweetheart, you wouldn't have gotten this far without us. Who taught you to be strong? Who paid your tuition? You didn't build yourself alone." She always knew how to wrap the knife in silk. I had stared at my plate, the clatter of utensils, the only sound left. Lauren reached for her wine, shaking her head. "You take everything so personally, Clara." "It's family. Family shares." I'd wanted to say that family also respects. That family doesn't show up with moving trucks uninvited. But back then, I still believed silence kept peace. Now, on this endless stretch of road, I realized that silence was the rope they'd used to pull me back every time I tried to walk away. Snowflakes began to fall heavier, small white bursts against the dark pavement. The radio crackled and came alive with a weather report. "Storm advisory for Pitkin County," the announcer said. If you're in the Highlands or planning to travel north, secure your homes and avoid unnecessary trips. The words made me exhale a bitter laugh. Already done, I said to the empty car. My phone vibrated on the passenger seat. Another notification from the home system. Perimeter locked. All doors secure. I kept my eyes on the road but felt the message like a heartbeat in my chest. The past kept playing in flashes. Mom standing in the doorway when I was 17 saying, "Don't move so far away. You'll regret it." Lauren crying on the phone after her divorce, asking to borrow money just until things settle. My father's quiet sigh when he thought I couldn't hear. His way of saying he agreed with them but didn't want to take sides. They were a web I'd spent a lifetime untangling myself from. Every thread I cut seemed to wrap around me again. As I crossed into Colorado, the landscape opened wider. Snow-tipped peaks, stretches of pine, the horizon tinted with fading light. I rolled down the window for a moment. The air was sharp cold enough to sting. I tried to picture them inside my house. My mother reorganizing the kitchen, Lauren laying claim to the master suite, the kids laughing as if it were a game. Maybe they were convinced they were rescuing me from loneliness. Maybe they believed they were entitled to the comfort I'd built for myself. They'd told that story before. To me, to others, to themselves. Clara's selfish, they'd say. She thinks she's better than us. The worst part was that I'd spent years trying to prove them wrong. I'd paid bills I didn't owe, agreed to favors I didn't have time for, tried to earn the love that should have been unconditional. Now I saw it for what it was, a bargain written in invisible ink. The storm clouds ahead looked heavy, curling low over the mountains. I turned the headlights on, and the snow glowed in the beam like ash. The road sign said 90 miles to Aspen Highlands. My phone buzzed again. This time, a text from Lauren. Just 6 words. "We're home now. Don't be dramatic." I let out a slow breath, the kind that feels like it's scraping your ribs on the way out. My hands were steady on the wheel. I didn't respond. Outside, the storm thickened. The announcer's voice on the radio came back faint through the static. "If you're near the Highlands, stay safe. Lock your doors." I smiled to myself, the faintest trace of satisfaction cutting through the dread. "I already have," I said. The wind howled louder as I climbed higher into the mountains, and the lights of the city disappeared behind me. Ahead, only snow silence and the villa waiting, along with everything I'd been running from my whole life. By the time I reached Aspen Highlands, dusk had folded itself over the mountains like a heavy blanket. The snow on the forest road glittered faintly under my headlights, the tires crunching and hissing against the frozen gravel. The drive up had been slow, too quiet, the kind of silence that hums just before something breaks. When the trees finally thinned and the curve opened to the ridge, I saw it. My house. The lights were on in every window. Warm, golden light spilled through the glass and onto the snow. It should have looked beautiful. Instead, it looked violated. The rental truck was still parked crooked at the end of the drive. The garage door was wide open. My workbench light was on, and inside someone had moved my equipment to make room for boxes. I pulled up behind the truck and turned off the engine. For a moment, I sat there gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Through the windshield, I could see faint shapes moving across the windows inside, shadows against light, then laughter. Not one laugh, but several. My mother's high, controlled voice, Lauren's deeper one, the bright echoes of Owen and Piper running somewhere upstairs. It was the sound of comfort, of belonging, and none of it belonged to them. My chest tightened. I took out my phone and opened the live security feed. The camera on the porch caught my mother standing right at the doorway, smiling toward the camera, as if she knew I was watching. "There she is," she said to someone inside. "We all live here now, sweetheart. You wouldn't turn your back on family, would you?" Her tone was sweet, almost playful, but her eyes were steel. I stared at her face on the screen, that same calm expression she wore at every family gathering before she twisted a knife with words. My jaw clenched. I didn't move, didn't honk, didn't step out. I just slid my thumb across the app and hit the command to lock the system. A soft chime sounded from the phone, followed by a series of mechanical clicks echoing through the live feed. One by one, the doors sealed. The front, the back, the windows, the sliding glass to the deck. Inside, Lauren's voice cut through Mom. "The door won't open." "What the hell is she doing?" "Clara." My mother's voice rose sharp and indignant. "You can't do this to your family!" I watched as she banged her hand against the glass face, flushed with anger. I exhaled slowly, almost shaking, but not quite. I switched to the interior camera. The movers had frozen in the middle of carrying a dresser. My sister was arguing with my mother, pointing at the door. The kids looked confused, scared even. For a second, guilt flickered through me, sharp and fleeting. But it didn't stay. This wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. I tapped the screen again, enabling the voice intercom. "You're trespassing," I said. My voice sounded steady, distant, almost unrecognizable. "Leave the property." Lauren whipped her head toward the camera, glaring. "You're being insane, Clara. It's family property. We helped you pay for it. You gave me $2,000 10 years ago," I said flatly. "That doesn't make it yours." Mom leaned close to the camera, her breath fogging the lens. "You don't mean this," she said. "We'll talk about it when you calm down." I ended the feed before I could answer. The snow crunched under my boots when I finally stepped out of the car. The air was sharp, biting against my cheeks. The house loomed in front of me, glowing in the twilight, like some beautiful thing that had turned on me. I could still hear them through the walls. Their voices muffled, but furious. I took one more look at the house before pulling my coat tighter and dialing the sheriff's office. "Pitkin County Sheriff's Department." A calm voice answered. "My name is Clara Monroe," I said, forcing my tone to stay even. "There are people inside my residence. I have live footage of them entering without permission. The dispatcher asked for the address, my contact number, whether anyone was armed. I answered each question mechanically. "We'll send a unit to your location," she said. "Stay in your vehicle and do not approach." When the call ended, I stood there for a moment, the phone still warm against my ear. The wind cut across the ridge, carrying the faint hum of laughter that didn't sound like laughter anymore. The sky had turned a deep blue, the first stars appearing above the tree line. The forest around the property seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled low and mournful. Then faintly the sound of sirens. Small at first, then growing louder, bouncing off the mountain walls. Red and blue lights flickered through the trees. Inside the house, I could see movement again. Lauren rushing to the window, my mother grabbing the children, the movers stepping back, unsure. The noise of the sirens reached them, and the entire tableau shifted from control to panic. I stood by the car. Arms crossed, the wind pulling strands of hair across my face. The deputies' SUVs rolled up the drive, crunching over the snow. One of them got out a tall man in a dark jacket with the county badge stitched over his chest. He glanced at me. "You the homeowner?" "Yes," I said. He nodded once. "Stay put." He and another deputy walked to the porch, their flashlights cutting white arcs through the air. They knocked, spoke waited. The door stayed locked. Then my mother's voice, muffled but shrill. "She locked us in. My daughter locked her own family in." The deputy's tone stayed level. "Ma'am, please step away from the door." From where I stood, the scene was half absurd, half tragic. My mother trying to play the victim while standing inside the house she'd broken into. The second deputy came back toward me. "They say you're their daughter." I said. "And they're inside my home without permission. Everything's recorded." I handed him my phone. He scrolled through the footage, the glow of the screen reflecting in his face. "You did the right thing calling us," he said finally. "We'll get them out." I nodded, my throat tight, but my body calm. The sirens had stopped, and now only the sound of the wind moved between the pines. The deputies escorted them out one by one, Lauren first, then the kids, then my mother still talking fast, her hands gesturing wildly. She looked right at me as she stepped into the snow, fury mixed with disbelief. "You've embarrassed yourself," she hissed. "And you'll regret this." I said nothing. The kids looked down, clinging to Lauren's coat. The deputies guided them toward the truck, writing down statements, taking notes. One of them told me quietly, "We'll file a report. If they come back, call immediately." I nodded, still staring at the house. My house. Now empty again except for the echo of their voices. When the last of the red and blue lights faded down the hill, I stood there in the dark, the cold seeping through my gloves. My breath came out in visible clouds, uneven, shaking just slightly. I turned back toward the villa. Through the glass, the lights still glowed softly like nothing had happened. But I knew better. Something had cracked wide open tonight, something that couldn't be sealed by any lock. I whispered to myself, not sure whether it was anger or grief that edged my voice. I used to think betrayal was when people left, but sometimes betrayal is when they come back. The wind rose again, carrying the sound of it away into the trees. Red and blue light sliced through the trees as the police cruisers turned up the last bend of the drive. The sirens had quieted, but the rhythm of the lights still pulsed against the snow, coloring the pines like they were on fire. I stood near my car, arms folded, trying not to shiver. Not from the cold, but from everything happening at once. One of the officers stepped out of the lead vehicle, a man in his late 40s, tall, with a steady, unhurried way of moving. His name tag read Hartley. He gave me a brief nod. "Evening, ma'am. You the homeowner?" "Yes," I said, my breath coming out white. "Clara Monroe. I called it in." He adjusted his flashlight, scanning the driveway, the open garage, the moving truck idling with its back door half open. "You got proof of ownership on you?" I nodded, reaching into the folder I'd brought, in case this went exactly how it was going. Title deed, mortgage statements, property taxes. My fingers were shaking as I handed them over. Hartley glanced at the documents under the beam of his light, then handed them back with a slight nod. "All clear. Please stay out here while we handle this." Inside the house, the voices were rising again. My mother's voice carried over the cold night air. Sharp, indignant. "You can't treat us like criminals." "We're her family." Another officer, a younger man with a calm tone, answered through the door. "Ma'am, are you currently living at this address?" "No, but it's family property," she snapped. "So you're not on the lease or the title." There was a long pause. "No, but that doesn't matter." The deputy's voice stayed even. "It does matter, ma'am." I heard Lauren's voice next, frantic. "She locked us in. She actually locked us in the house." "She what?" the younger deputy repeated, clearly confused. Lauren went on, her voice breaking for effect. "My kids were crying. We couldn't get out. Who does that to their own mother is—" Rowan's voice suddenly joined from the edge of the property. "She must have walked over when she saw the lights." "That's not true," she said, raising her phone like proof. "They moved in this morning. I saw the truck at 9 a.m. I even heard her mother tell the movers it was family property. They've been carrying boxes in all day." The deputy turned toward me, eyebrows lifting slightly. "Seems like this isn't the first time something like this happened." "Huh." I shook my head. "No, officer. This is the first and last time." They went back to the porch. Through the window, I could see my mother gesturing wildly. Lauren clutching both kids, her voice still loud. "You're traumatizing my children." Hartley held up a hand to quiet her. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you and your family to exit the property. You can gather your things, but you'll need to leave tonight." Evelyn's voice rose again, brittle and theatrical. "She's destroying this family." "This is humiliation, Mom," I called quietly from the driveway. "You did that long before tonight." Her eyes snapped to me through the window, the fury there so bright it almost glowed. "You think you're better than us now? You think your success gives you the right to treat us like strangers?" I didn't answer. Hartley opened the door with his key override, and 2 officers escorted them outside one by one. Lauren came first, holding Owen by the wrist. "This is so unnecessary," she muttered, avoiding my eyes. Piper was crying softly, rubbing her face against her mother's coat. "Aunt Clara doesn't love us anymore," she sobbed. My throat tightened, but I didn't move. I couldn't. Next came Evelyn, stepping onto the porch as though she were walking to an execution. Her voice shook, not with fear, but anger. "You'll regret this," she said, her face inches from mine. "Blood is thicker than whatever this ego is." I met her eyes. "Blood isn't a deed, Mom." For the first time, she didn't have an answer. The movers shuffled awkwardly behind her, whispering to each other. One of them gestured toward me. "Ma'am, we didn't know. We were just told to unload." "I know," I said softly. "You can finish loading back up." The officers stood by as the truck door slammed shut, and the family climbed inside their SUV. My mother glared at me from the passenger seat, eyes wide and wet. Lauren didn't look up at all. The kids sat in the back silent now, their faces turned toward the dark window. When the convoy of headlights disappeared down the mountain road, only the echo of the tires crunching snow remained. Hartley handed me a clipboard with a form attached. "Here's the report for tonight. It'll be on record if they try this again. If they come back, call us right away. I nodded, signing where he pointed. My hands had finally stopped shaking. Thank you, officer. He tipped his hat slightly. You did right, ma'am. Most folks would have opened the door and let it turn ugly. Standing firm takes guts. When the cruisers left, the forest swallowed the noise. Only the steady hum of the villa's generator filled the night. I stood at the bottom of the steps, staring at the front door. The same door my mother had tried to claim as hers. The snow reflected the porch light bright enough to make the night seem smaller. Inside the house was untouched, but no longer peaceful. Every wall felt like it had listened to the shouting absorbed the betrayal. I walked through slowly, checking each room, rewriting the things they had moved. The kitchen smelled faintly of my mother's perfume, lavender and guilt. I wiped down the counters anyway. By the time I sat at the dining table, it was almost midnight. The silence was so deep, it buzzed in my ears. A week later, the peace fractured again. I came home from work to find a thick manila envelope wedged in the mail slot. The return address was a law firm in Denver I didn't recognize. My stomach sank as I tore it open. Complaint of unlawful detainment. It read in bold type. The plaintiffs, Evelyn and Lauren Monroe. They were suing me for locking them in for emotional distress, for humiliation. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one I'd just cleaned that night, and stared at the words until they blurred. The wind rattled the window panes. One sheet of paper slipped from my hand and slid across the floor. The phone rang. Unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Ms. Monroe. The voice was female, calm, professional. This is Angela Ruiz. Deputy Hartley gave me your name. I'm a civil attorney in Denver. He said you might need someone to represent you. For a second, all I could do was breathe. You heard about the case already. Let's just say I've seen families tear each other apart over property before. You're not alone. I pressed my fingers to my temples. I didn't want to fight them. I just wanted them to stop. Then we'll make sure they have to. Angela said simply. After the call ended, I sat in the dark, staring at the stack of legal papers. The wind from the mountains slipped through the crack of the window, lifting the corner of one page and carrying it to the floor. I didn't pick it up. I looked around my house, my walls, my furniture, my space, and whispered to the quiet room. I didn't start this. The house didn't answer. The only sound was the faint creak of timber settling in the cold like a long, exhausted sigh. The next Saturday, I drove down to Boulder, the town where I'd grown up, and spent most of my life trying to forget. The sky was the color of concrete, heavy, with the threat of snow. My old neighborhood looked smaller than I remembered. Rows of modest houses, the kind where lawns were still neatly edged and porch lights flickered on even in daylight. My parents' house was the same faded yellow paint peeling near the gutters, wind chimes clanging weakly in the cold. When I pulled up, the curtains shifted. A moment later, the front door opened and my father stood there. Clara, he said, as if he hadn't expected me to actually come. His face looked older than I remembered, lines deepened, shoulders sagging under some invisible weight. I just want to talk, I said. He stepped aside, motioning me in without meeting my eyes. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and stale air, the scent of a place kept neat for appearances rather than comfort. Lauren was in the living room, kneeling on the rug, folding laundry that wasn't hers. She didn't look up. Well, look who finally decided to show her face. On the couch, my mother sat straight-backed, a blanket around her shoulders, hands clasped in her lap. Her expression didn't change when I entered. She didn't even pretend to smile. Hi, Mom, I said quietly. Don't, she replied. We're not doing small talk today. For a moment, none of us spoke. The only sound came from the ticking of the clock on the wall, the same clock that used to hang in my childhood bedroom. Its hands always a few minutes slow. Finally, I broke the silence. You need to stop this. You can't keep coming to my house pretending it's yours. You need to leave me alone. My mother's eyes flashed cold and quick. There is no mine or yours in family. Everything we have, we share. Share. I laughed softly. Disbelief cutting through the tension. You don't share, Mom. You take. Her chin lifted. I gave you life, Clara. Everything you are. Your education, your success, came from this family. From me. And I've been repaying that debt my entire adult life, I said. But this is where it ends. Lauren stood up, crossing her arms. God, listen to yourself. You sound heartless. Mom just wants somewhere safe for the kids. You live alone in that big villa and you can't spare a few rooms. You're unbelievable. I glanced at Owen and Piper sitting in the corner quietly coloring in a book. They looked up at me confused, innocent. For a second, my chest tightened. Then I steadied my voice. You want to talk about unbelievable? You moved into my house without permission. You broke in Lauren. Her face twisted. You locked us inside like animals. You locked yourselves inside the moment you decided what's mine belongs to you, I said. My mother's voice rose, trembling with anger. Stop twisting things. You know what this family has been through. We've always looked out for each other. When your sister's marriage fell apart, who helped her? When your father got sick, who covered the bills? I did, I said. And every time you called it family. But family isn't a free pass to walk over someone. My father spoke then softly. Clara, maybe we should all calm down, but the room had already turned sharp. The heat from the argument clashed with the cold air sneaking through the old windows. My mother leaned forward, voice low. You've changed. You think you're better than us because you built that fancy house in the mountains. You forgot where you came from. I remember exactly where I came from, I said. That's why I left. Her mouth tightened. You're selfish. I'm surviving, I replied. Lauren slammed the basket of laundry onto the couch. Mom just wants a place for the kids. She just wants the kids to have somewhere to go when she's gone. But of course that's too much to ask from St. Clara. I'm not the saint, I said. I'm just the only one who stopped pretending we're a normal family. Owen dropped his crayon. Mommy, are you mad? He whispered. Lauren picked it up and muttered something to him, but he didn't look convinced. I looked at them, two little kids caught in the same web I'd been tangled in my whole life, and felt something inside me twist painfully. I wanted to scoop them up and take them out of this house, away from the guilt and manipulation. But I couldn't fix what I didn't break. I'm leaving, I said finally. As I turned for the door, Lauren called out, Don't bother pretending you care. We'll be fine. We're almost done filing the address change anyway. Mom, remember the paperwork for the villa. The words froze me mid-step. What did you just say? Lauren blinked, realizing too late what she'd revealed. My mother's mouth opened, then shut again. My father turned away, rubbing his temple. You're registering my address, I said slowly. You're trying to establish residency. It's just paperwork, Lauren said weakly. No, I said. It's a setup. The air in the room changed like all the oxygen had been sucked out. My mother's face was pale now, but her jaw stayed clenched. You really don't understand family, she said. If you did, you'd know this is how we protect what's ours. I stared at her. What's ours? Or what's mine? Snow began to drift past the window light, and soundless. I felt suddenly tired. Tired in a way that went beyond sleep. Without another word, I turned and walked out. The front door creaked shut behind me, muffling whatever my mother shouted next. Outside, the first flakes of snow clung to my coat. I walked to the car, my hands shaking as I pulled the keys from my pocket. I sat behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles ache. My breath fogged the glass, and for a long time, I just stared at the reflection of the house in the rearview mirror. The home I'd grown up in looked smaller, now. Uglier somehow, like it had shrunk under the weight of all the lies. Tears welled uninvited, and I let them fall. Quiet restrained the kind that burn more than they soothe. Not because I was weak, because I finally understood how far they were willing to go to destroy me. My phone buzzed in the console. Angela Ruiz's name lit up the screen. I answered before the first ring ended. Angela. I said, voice steady despite everything I want to counter-sue, not just defend. There was a pause, then her calm voice. That's the first smart thing you've said since this started. You're finally standing up for yourself. The snow thickened outside, swirling under the streetlights like falling ash. As I drove away, I whispered to the empty road ahead. People say family love is unconditional, but what do you call it when the only condition is losing yourself? The tires rolled over the snow, the sound soft and endless like a lullaby for something already dead. The cafe was half empty when I arrived, the kind of quiet morning in downtown Denver, where the cold seemed to wrap itself around every sound. Frost clung to the windows, and the smell of burnt espresso hung in the air. I found a corner table by the window, the manila folder heavy in my hands. Every document, every receipt, every proof of what was mine. When Angela Ruiz walked in, she looked exactly as I'd imagined her. From her voice on the phone, sharp lines softened by calm, confidence hair, the color of dark, mahogany eyes that didn't miss a thing. She smiled once briefly and extended her hand. "Clara," she said, firm grip, warm tone. "You've had quite the week. That's one way to put it." She sat down across from me, removing her gloves, and gestured to the folder I'd brought. "Let's see what we're working with." I spread everything across the small table. Title deed, mortgage property tax receipts, screenshots from the security footage, and a printed log from the home automation app showing every time the locks were engaged. Angela flipped through the stack, methodical and precise. "Did your family contribute anything financially toward the purchase?" "They gave me $2,000. I said, "As a birthday gift, 10 years ago." Her eyebrow lifted. "A gift, Mom called it, a gesture. She even wrote 'Happy birthday, your first home someday' in the card." Angela leaned back, folding her arms. "Then this case is simple. They don't have a claim. What they do have is entitlement. And I've beaten entitlement before." Something in the way she said it made me pause. "You sound like you've lived this." Her smile was thin, but knowing. "My brother tried to take my land in New Mexico after our parents passed, told everyone I was greedy, said I didn't care about family. But the court called it what it was, ownership. I didn't betray my family, Clara. I just stopped letting them bleed me." For a long second, I just looked at her. Something tight in my chest loosening a little. "Then you know exactly what I'm up against. Better than most," she said. "And that's why we're not just going to defend. We're going to hit back." We spent the next 2 hours outlining the plan. Counterclaim, injunction for harassment, cease and desist notice. I'd need to submit camera footage, call logs, and proof of their false residency attempt. Angela highlighted every point with a red pen, neat lines across the margins. "You'll have to stay composed," she said, her voice firm but kind. "They'll try to bait you into reacting. Don't. They'll use every tear, every raised voice against you. Family fights get emotional. Legal cases can't." "I know," I said, even though my stomach turned at the thought of seeing my mother across a courtroom. Angela gathered the papers into an organized pile. "You're not the first woman who's had to choose between peace and family. But you might be one of the few willing to pick peace and fight for it." Outside, the wind howled down the street, scattering a swirl of snow against the window. I looked out and said quietly, "It doesn't feel like peace yet." "It will," Angela said, standing. "Now go home. I'll draft everything tonight. You'll get the first filings by tomorrow morning." We shook hands again before parting. Her grip was steady grounding. On the drive back to Aspen, the highway stretched endless and gray, the mountains rising like frozen waves in the distance. My phone buzzed against the console. Dad's number. I hesitated, then answered. "Clara." His voice sounded weary, like it carried years of trying to stay in the middle. "Can we talk?" "About what? About your mother? She's not well. The stress is getting to her. Maybe if you'd just let things cool down." I interrupted softly. "Dad, she's the one who started this. I know she can be." "Intense," he said. "But dragging this through court, do you really think that helps anyone?" I looked at the snow whipping across the windshield. "It helps me, Dad. Because every time I tried to talk, she twisted it into guilt. This is the only language she understands." He sighed. "She just wants you to forgive her. I did." I said quietly, "Years ago, that's not the same as letting her win." For a moment, there was only static on the line. Then his voice again, softer now. "You sound like her when you're angry." I let out a bitter laugh. "Maybe, but the difference is I won't take what doesn't belong to me." I hung up before he could reply. The silence afterward was loud. That night back at the villa, I couldn't sleep. I poured myself tea and sat in the dim glow of the living room lamp, scrolling through the security feed out of habit. The cameras had recorded movement outside an hour earlier. I clicked play. The image was grainy, but clear enough. A figure stood at the edge of the property near the fence, barely illuminated by the motion light. My mother. Her coat was buttoned up, her hair tucked into a scarf. She just stood there, staring at the house, at my window, not moving, not knocking, just watching. The footage looped, then ended. My stomach twisted. I rewound it again. Same posture, same stillness, her face unreadable, but familiar in its coldness. I pressed a hand to my mouth and whispered, What are you doing, Mom? The question echoed off the walls unanswered. At 11:47 p.m., my phone rang again. Angela. Sorry for the late call, she said quickly. I've been going through public records for your case. My pulse jumped. What did you find? Your mother retained her own attorney this afternoon. Officially, the payment came through your father's account. Same last name, but she's listed as the client. They're preparing a motion to strike your counterclaim. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Of course she did. Angela's voice softened, but her words stayed sharp. Don't panic. It just means they're scared. People only fight this hard when they know they're losing control. The silence between us stretched for a beat. Then she added, Clara, this is where you stop reacting and start leading. Let them chase you for once. When I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, the glow from the phone screen fading to black. The house felt vast and still, around me the snow outside reflecting faint light into the windows. Somewhere deep in my chest, the fear that had once kept me small began to shift, hardening into something else. I whispered to myself, almost afraid to say it out loud. I'm not her daughter anymore. I'm the woman she should be afraid of. The heater clicked on softly, filling the silence with a low hum. And for the first time since it all began, I believed my own words. The leaves in Boulder had already turned gold when I drove back into town that afternoon, a thermos of hot soup on the passenger seat. The air carried that dry chill that comes just before winter, when the sky looks like brushed steel and every sound seems sharper. Dad's house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, the same faded siding, the same mailbox leaning slightly forward like it was tired of standing guard. When I rang the bell, it took him a while to answer. The door finally creaked open, and there he was. Richard Monroe, thinner than I remembered, wrapped in an old cardigan. His face broke into a weak smile. Clara, he said, stepping back to let me in. You didn't have to drive all this way. You sounded worse on the phone, I said, holding up the soup. Thought you might actually eat if someone brought it to you. He chuckled softly, but it turned into a cough, deep and harsh. He waved it off like it was nothing. The house was warm, but stale curtains drawn halfway. The air thick with the smell of dust and eucalyptus cough drops. I poured him some soup and watched him eat in silence for a while. It was strange how quiet it was. No TV, no radio, no signs of my mother. She's not here, I finally asked. He shook his head. She went to church this morning. Women's prayer group, or so she said. Probably just needed space. Space. The word felt ironic. My mother had invaded every inch of mine. When he finished, he leaned back in the chair and sighed. There's something I want to show you. He stood slowly, joints stiff, and shuffled to the old hallway closet. I heard boxes shifting the scrape of metal. When he returned, he carried a small tin box, scratched and dented, the kind people use to keep recipes or receipts in. She hid this for years, he said, setting it on the table between us. I think maybe it's time you saw what's inside. I hesitated before opening it. Inside was a stack of yellowed papers, edges curled, held together with a brittle rubber band. Beneath them were a few photographs faded almost to sepia. I pulled one out and stared. It was a woman. Young, beautiful, in a severe way I almost recognized. My mother. Her hair was darker, then her expression hard even through the grain of the picture. She was standing in front of a small house with a foreclosure notice nailed to the door. In her arms, a baby, Lauren not even 2 years old. Who took this? I asked quietly. Probably one of the neighbors, Dad said. That was 1988. Before I met her, I flipped through the papers. Mortgage agreements, eviction notices, an old marriage certificate. The name beside hers wasn't Richard Monroe. It was someone I'd never seen before. Daniel Rios. My throat tightened. She was married before you. He nodded. For 5 years. They bought a place in Fort Collins, tried to start a life. But then he lost his job. The bank came for the house and she lost everything. Took Lauren and never looked back. I traced the line of my mother's signature on one of the documents, bold and neat. She never told me any of this. She doesn't talk about it, he said. You have to understand, she wasn't always like this. Back then, she believed in people. Believed in love. Losing that house broke something in her. I set the photo down. My pure, steady but heavy. So that's why she's obsessed with ownership. With keeping things under the name family. Dad nodded. She thought if everything belonged to everyone, she could never lose it again. She doesn't see it's the same thing that's destroying her now. The radiator clicked, releasing a hiss of warm air. I stared at the picture again. My mother standing in front of that condemned house, eyes fixed straight ahead, defiant and terrified at once. She's not evil, Clara, Dad said quietly. She's just afraid. I looked up, meeting his tired eyes. Being afraid doesn't give anyone the right to take what isn't theirs. He didn't answer, just nodded. Eyes clouded with something between regret and resignation. When I left, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, turning the sky, the color of copper. I stood by my car for a moment, looking back at the house I'd grown up in. The porch light flickered, catching in the frost on the window. My father waved weakly from the doorway, and for a moment I wished I could freeze time there, before everything went wrong, before we all turned into strangers who shared a name. The drive back to Aspen felt longer than usual. The highway stretched ahead, framed by autumn trees whose leaves shimmered gold under the last light. Through each small town I saw houses with porch swings, windows glowing with warm lamplight, families sitting down to dinner. Normal. Peaceful. The kind of life that always seemed to belong to other people. When I finally reached the mountain road leading up to the villa, dusk had settled fully. The house stood quiet, outlined in faint blue shadows. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the wind moving through the pines. Inside, the villa smelled faintly of pine wood and coffee grounds. Everything was still where I'd left it. The throw blanket on the couch, the unfinished sketch on my desk, the faint hum of the security system. I placed my keys on the counter and turned slowly, letting my eyes trace the space. My mother's voice echoed in my head, a memory I couldn't silence. One day you'll know what it feels like to lose everything. I looked around the house, my house, and whispered back, "You were right, Mom. I do know. But I learned something you never did." I walked to the window, looking out over the valley, as the lights of the town below began to flicker on, scattered like stars. You can lose everything and still keep yourself. I sat down at my desk, the weight of the tin box still lingering in my mind. The papers from 1988, the house, the fear, it all made sense now. Her obsession, her manipulation, her need to control. Understanding didn't bring forgiveness, but it did bring clarity. I opened my laptop, the screen glowing pale blue in the dark room. My hands hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I began to type. "Angela," I wrote, "I'm ready for court. Even if it means ending this family for good." I hit send before I could change my mind. Outside, the wind rose again, sweeping through the trees like a warning or a promise. Inside, the house held steady, its silence no longer heavy but resolute, like it finally knew which side it stood on. The wind howled that night, rattling the windows like it was trying to get in. I was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, court filings, receipts, emails printed in neat stacks, when my phone buzzed with a low, vibrating chime. The screen flashed with a security alert. Motion detected, back entrance. I froze. The clock on the wall read 11:42 a.m. I opened the camera feed. The image flickered once, then sharpened into color. A figure stood by the back door, half hidden by the porch shadows. The motion light caught her profile for just a second. Dark coat hair tied high, familiar posture. Lauren, my breath caught in my throat. She crouched, gloved hands moving around the lock flashlight beam, trembling against the wood. She wasn't fumbling. She knew exactly what she was doing. I reached for my phone, but hesitated, the air in the room thick and still. For one insane moment, I imagined throwing open the door, shouting her name, demanding to know why. But the rational part of me, the part Angela had taught me to hold on to, pulled me back. "Don't react. They want you to lose control." I pressed the emergency icon instead, 911. "What's your emergency?" "This is Clara Monroe," I said, my voice steady. "There's someone attempting to break into my home. I have them on camera right now." The operator's voice was calm, practiced. "Are you in a safe place, ma'am?" "Yes. Doors are locked. Cameras recording. Stay where you are. Deputies are on their way." I watched the live feed while I waited, my pulse loud in my ears. Lauren's flashlight flickered off, and for a few seconds she just stood there, her face barely visible, head tilted as if listening. Then she stepped back and disappeared into the tree line. The wind screamed through the pines again, shaking loose a shower of snow from the roof. I sat motionless until the distant wail of sirens began to rise from the valley below. By the time the flashing lights turned up the driveway, my hands were trembling. Deputy Grant Hartley was first to step out of the cruiser. "Evening again, Ms. Monroe," he said, his breath visible in the cold. "You all right?" "I'm fine," I said. "She's gone." He nodded toward the porch. "Mind showing me where you saw her?" We walked around the side of the villa, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Snow crunched under our boots, the sound oddly loud in the still air. At the back door, he stopped, crouching to inspect the lock. Fresh scratches marked the brass plate, jagged and new. A single black glove lay half buried in the snow beside the steps. Hartley looked up at me. "You recognize this?" I hesitated. "It's my sister's size. Same brand she wears. Do you want to make a formal statement?" I nodded. "Yes, everything's on the camera system. Cloud backup, too." He pulled out his notepad, jotting details, while another officer took photos. The cold seeped through my coat, but I barely felt it. I was watching the tree line, half expecting another shadow to step out. When they finished, Hartley handed me the incident slip. "If you think they're escalating, consider a protective order. I'll add this to your existing file. I appreciate it." I said. My voice sounded detached, like it belonged to someone else. He studied me for a moment before tipping his hat. "You've got good instincts. Monroe, keep trusting them." When their cars disappeared down the road, silence flooded back in heavy and complete. The wind had died down, leaving only the whisper of snow falling from the roof. I stood by the window for a long time, looking out at the faint glow of the porch light reflecting off the frost. Somewhere in the darkness, my sister had walked away, believing she still had power over me. She didn't. Not anymore. By morning, I'd already called a contractor. The van pulled up just after sunrise, tires kicking up mist from the wet snow. 2 men installed new motion lights, upgraded cameras, and an alarm system linked directly to the sheriff's department. While they worked, Mrs. Rowan showed up carrying a thermos of coffee. She didn't even wait to be invited in. She just stepped through the door like someone who'd already decided she was part of the story. "I saw the lights last night," she said, setting the thermos down. "Did they come back?" "Just one of them," I said. "My sister." Her face tightened, but she didn't look surprised. "They're not going to stop," I exhaled. "I know." She picked up a rag and started wiping the window glass where snow had fogged the corners. "Then you make sure they don't win. You're stronger than they think, Clara. I've seen women survive worse and come out sharper than steel." I wanted to thank her, but the lump in my throat made it hard to speak. Instead, I nodded and handed her one of the new sensors to install near the kitchen door. By noon, the contractors packed up. The house hummed with new energy, tiny green lights blinking on the cameras, the faint mechanical tick of sensors syncing. It felt less like a home and more like a fortress, but for now, that was enough. Later that afternoon, the mail truck trundled up the hill. I met the driver halfway down the path to sign for a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. The handwriting was rushed, jagged. "Stop before it's too late." No name, no signature, just those words, heavy and deliberate. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. I looked around. The empty woods, the stretch of white snow, the line of my breath in the cold air. Nobody. I went inside, locked the door, and laid the letter on the table beside the other files. Fear prickled somewhere deep under my skin, but it didn't spread. It just sat there, familiar, like a memory I no longer obeyed. I slid the note into a plastic sleeve, labeled it, and placed it neatly into the evidence folder. Then I opened the safe beneath my desk, tucked the folder inside, and turned the key until I heard the final click. Standing up, I caught my reflection in the window. Tired eyes, hair pulled back, the faintest trace of steel in my expression. "They still think I'm the scared kid they used to control," I whispered to the empty room. But fear's on my side now. The heater kicked on, and the hum filled the quiet. I sat back at the table, the mountain wind pressing gently against the walls, and for the first time that night, I realized I wasn't trembling. The courthouse in Summit County was already buzzing when we arrived. Cold October air drifted through the open doors, carrying the smell of coffee and wet leaves. My breath fogged in the chill as Angela and I stepped through security. The folder in my hands feeling heavier than anything I'd ever carried. Inside the hallway was a blur of suits, heels, and hushed voices. Angela walked beside me, composed as always, her dark hair tied back, eyes sharp. She turned slightly and said quietly, You ready for this? As ready as I'll ever be. In courtroom 3, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. My mother and sister were already there. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table in a gray suit that didn't quite fit her. Her hands folded tightly in her lap, Lauren sat beside her chin, lifted expression, rehearsed. Behind them, Owen and Piper sat with a court-appointed child advocate, their feet dangling above the floor. They looked small, confused. For a moment, guilt pricked at me, but it was a ghost of an old feeling, not enough to sway me. Angela leaned toward me and whispered, "Remember, let me do the talking. The truth's on our side." The judge entered, an older man with a steady gait and a voice that filled the room. "Court is now in session. Case 23C4817. Monroe versus Monroe." Hearing my last name twice in one sentence made my stomach twist. Evelyn stood when called, voice trembling but clear. "Your Honor, my daughter locked us inside her home for hours. My grandchildren were terrified. She humiliated her family in front of strangers and police officers. We just wanted to live together as a family." She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the performance deliberate but convincing. A few people in the gallery murmured. I looked down at my hands, forcing myself not to react. The judge nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Monroe. We'll hear from the defense." Angela rose smoothly, buttoning her jacket. "Your Honor, we have no intention of diminishing the plaintiff's emotions, but what Mrs. Monroe calls family bonding, the law calls trespassing." A flicker of movement crossed my mother's face. Angela reached into the folder, slid a USB across to the bailiff, and said, "We'd like to submit Exhibit A, home security footage from the date in question." The lights dimmed slightly as the screen flickered to life. The video began with the wide shot of the driveway, the moving truck pulling in, the garage door rolling open, Evelyn directing movers with one hand, Lauren carrying a box through the door, the kids laughing as they ran across the yard. Then came the sound, Evelyn's voice, crisp and confident. "We all live here now. Clara doesn't mind. This is family property." The room went utterly still. The next clip showed Lauren opening my refrigerator, unloading grocery bags, laughing. Then the muffled sound of the locks clicking, followed by Lauren shouting, "She locked us in." She actually locked us in. The bailiff stopped the video. Silence hung in the air, thick and tangible. Angela waited a beat before speaking. "Your Honor, that footage was recorded directly from the defendant's security system. It shows no distress until after the locks engaged, because the plaintiffs had already entered unlawfully." The judge adjusted his glasses, and this was verified by the responding deputies. "Yes, Your Honor," Angela said. "We also have written statements from Deputy Grant Hartley and neighbor witness, Mrs. Rowan." She called Mrs. Rowan to the stand. The older woman walked forward, steady but nervous. I caught her eye briefly, and she gave me a small reassuring nod. Angela began, "Mrs. Rowan, can you tell the court what you saw that day?" "I saw the moving truck arrive early in the morning," she said. "They unloaded furniture boxes, children's toys. Mrs. Monroe told me it was their house now. I thought Clara had sold it, but when I called her, she said she had no idea what was happening." "And was there any sign of distress before the locks engaged?" Angela asked. "No, ma'am," Rowan said firmly. "They looked happy, like people moving in." Evelyn's attorney tried to object, muttering about bias, but the judge waved him off. Angela turned back to the bench. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows this was not a misunderstanding or a family dispute. This was an attempt to seize property under false pretenses." The judge leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, addressing my mother, "do you have any documentation proving shared ownership?" Her attorney stood, papers trembling slightly in his hand. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs contributed financially toward the property's purchase, $2,000 in 2013. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Do you have any record that this was a loan or investment?" Evelyn's lips parted, but no sound came out. "No, Your Honor," her lawyer admitted finally. Then legally, the judge said, voice cutting through the air like the crack of a whip, "that contribution does not constitute ownership or entitlement to residency." Evelyn's hand flew to her chest. "But we're family," she said softly. "She's my daughter." The judge's tone didn't soften. "Family does not override property law in the state of Colorado. You entered a home that was not yours. That is trespassing." Lauren whispered something to her attorney, eyes glassy but angry. Evelyn shook her head slowly, tears spilling down her face. Angela stood again. Your Honor, in addition to our motion to dismiss, we request a protective order against further harassment. The judge nodded once. Granted. Effective immediately. He lifted the gavel and brought it down with a firm crack that echoed through the courtroom. The sound hit me like a release, a sharp noise that seemed to cut the last invisible thread between us. Evelyn slumped in her chair, her composure gone. You killed me, she whispered, voice trembling. You've killed your own mother. I looked at her steady and quiet. No, Mom, I just stopped letting you kill me. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the sound of papers rustling broke the silence, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of people leaving. Angela rested a hand lightly on my shoulder. It's over, she said. But in my chest, I knew it wasn't over. Not really. Freedom, I realized, wasn't something the court could grant. It was something I'd already taken the night I locked those doors. Still, when I stepped out into the crisp October air, the sky wide and bright above the courthouse, I finally let myself breathe. The cold hit my lungs like clarity, clean and sharp. For the first time in my life, the air didn't taste like fear. It tasted like something new, like survival. 2 months passed, and winter took the mountains like a quiet siege. Snow blanketed everything. The roads, the trees, the roof of my villa, until it looked like something out of a postcard. Most mornings began the same, the fire humming in the hearth, coffee steaming in my hands. The kind of silence that feels like safety. For the first time in years, there was no one calling, no one asking, no one demanding. Just stillness. That peace lasted until my phone rang one morning. Angela's name lighting up the screen. Morning counselor. I said, trying to sound casual. Her voice was brisk but laced with something else. Satisfaction. You're going to want to sit down for this. I set my mug down on the counter. All right. What now? The IRS opened an investigation into your mother, she said. Apparently, the funds she used to retain her attorney came from an unreported account. They traced it through a consulting payment she funneled into your father's name. I went still. Outside, snow was falling so softly it barely seemed real. They're investigating her. Yep, it's routine for now, but they're taking it seriously. Paper trail's messy. If it's what it looks like, she'll have to answer for it. I didn't say anything. Angela must have sensed the weight of my silence. Clara, she said gently. You didn't do this. She did. I let out a long breath. I know. It's just strange. I spent half my life trying to protect her from consequences. Now they're finding her on their own. Law doesn't move fast, Angela said, but it moves. And when it does, it catches up to everyone. When we hung up, I stood there for a while watching the snow thicken through the glass doors. The wind pressed against the villa like a slow heartbeat. That afternoon, another piece of news reached me, this time through a friend of a friend in Boulder. Lauren had temporarily lost custody of Owen and Piper. The court filing cited emotional instability and exposure to family conflict detrimental to minors. I read the words 3 times, each one landing heavier than the last. For years, my sister had been shielded, coddled, enabled. And now the cracks she ignored had finally split open. The next call came from Dad. His voice was weaker than before, softer, the rasp of age and regret tangled together. Clara, he said your mother wants to see you. She's been quiet lately. Says she wants to make things right. I sat down on the edge of the couch, tracing my finger along the seam of the fabric. Make things right, how? She doesn't say much, he answered. Just keeps asking if you'll come. I looked out the window again, the snow still falling endless and indifferent. Dad, I don't hate her, I said finally. But seeing her again won't fix what she broke. Sometimes forgiveness is just letting the distance stay. He sighed, a tired sound, one that seemed to come from deeper than lungs. She's lost a lot lately. Maybe she finally understands. Maybe, I said softly. Or maybe she just misses control. He didn't argue, and I didn't fill the silence. Eventually, he said goodbye, his voice fading like an old song. That night, as I sat by the fire, my mind drifted somewhere it hadn't in years, to an image I'd never lived but had somehow inherited. My mother, decades younger, standing in the rain outside a small house with a foreclosure notice nailed to the door. Her first husband walking away, shoulders hunched under a gray coat. She's holding baby Lauren. Her face streaked with tears that no one saw because the rain hid them. Maybe that was the day she decided love and ownership were the same thing, that to lose property was to lose herself, but she was wrong. Love and possession are opposite languages. One frees, the other traps. Karma. I thought isn't punishment. It's a mirror. It shows you the damage you denied until it becomes impossible to look away. I pulled a blanket tighter around me, and walked toward the window. The snow outside shimmered silver under the moonlight, the trees bending gently under its weight. My reflection hovered faintly in the glass, calm, steady, unrecognizable from the woman who'd once trembled at her mother's voice. I opened the door and stepped out onto the deck. The air bit at my skin, crisp and pure. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked to the edge of the railing. From here, the valley stretched endlessly below, dark and quiet. The villa stood behind me, solid and still. I pressed my hand to the wall, feeling the cold seep through the wood, grounding me. Everything I'd fought for, the silence, the boundaries, the right to peace, was finally real. It hadn't come from revenge. It had come from reclaiming the space my mother tried to fill with her fear. Inside the fire flickered its light, spilling onto the floor in soft amber shapes. For a long time I stood there, breathing in the mountain air, listening to nothing but wind. It was the same sound I'd feared when I first moved here. Too quiet, too vast. But now it was music. The camera by the door rotated its small red light, sweeping the deck before pausing on me. A tiny mechanical guardian watching over everything I'd rebuilt. I smiled faintly. We're safe now. I whispered, not to anyone, not even to myself, just to the night. The snow kept falling soft and endless, erasing every footprint I'd made on the way out. And in that erasure, there was peace. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't gloat, just exists. The kind that feels like justice finally arriving quietly right on time. Winter had settled deep into the mountains by the time I finally stopped checking the locks every night. The forest around Aspen Highlands was buried in white, the pines heavy under snow that glittered faintly in the pale morning light. The air smelled clean, sharp, untouched. Inside, I'd started repainting the walls, soft cream instead of gray. I replaced the curtains, rearranged the furniture, and threw away everything that still smelled like the chaos that had once lived here. The house looked new, but it didn't feel strange. It felt reclaimed. I spent the morning sanding an old bookshelf I'd found in town. The rhythmic scrape of the paper against the wood was strangely soothing. Somewhere between the second and third coat of paint, I caught my reflection in the window. A woman with color in her cheeks, hair loose, shoulders relaxed. It took me a moment to realize I was smiling. Around noon, there was a soft knock at the door. When I opened it, the familiar scent of cinnamon and sugar hit me before I saw her. Mrs. Rowan stood on the porch, bundled in her thick winter coat, holding a pie tin covered in foil. "You're really turning this place into something beautiful," she said, stepping inside before I could protest. "Thought you might need something warm for the afternoon." "Is that apple?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Of course," she said, setting it on the counter. My secret weapon against mountain loneliness. We ended up sitting on the porch steps, hands wrapped around steaming mugs of tea, the pie cooling between us. The snow reflected sunlight so bright it made the air look almost gold. "You know," she said, "after a while most people in your shoes would have packed up and left. But you stayed. You said enough and meant it." I smiled faintly, watching the light dance across the trees. I used to think boundaries made me selfish, that saying no meant pushing love away. And now I know boundaries don't push love away, I said quietly. They make room for the kind that doesn't hurt. She nodded, her eyes kind, but knowing. Took me 50 years to learn that one. You're ahead of schedule. We sat there for a long time, not needing to fill the silence. The snow muffled every sound except the soft creak of the porch under our boots and the occasional rush of wind through the trees. It wasn't awkward silence. It was peace. When she left, I watched her walk down the path until the wind swallowed her figure into the shimmer of white. Then I went back inside and stood in the middle of the living room. I'd rearranged the furniture that morning, placing the couch closer to the window and the framed photographs back on the wall. Pictures from hikes, drawings from old design projects, a photo of me with Dad before everything broke. I left no space for ghosts. The afternoon sun drifted low, throwing long golden stripes across the floor. I opened the window just enough for the wind to slip through. The curtains fluttered softly, the sound like a whispering breath. For the first time, the house didn't sound haunted. It sounded alive. As I wiped the last trace of dust from the shelf, my phone buzzed on the counter. A message preview flashed across the screen. "Lauren, Mom's in the hospital. She wants to see you." I stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering over the message. There it was again. The pull of old habits, that reflex to fix, to rush, to forgive before the wound had even finished closing. But my hands didn't move. My chest ached, yes, but not from panic or guilt, just the quiet ache of knowing some things weren't mine to repair. I sat down at the kitchen table looking out the window as the light shifted, fading into the soft blue of late afternoon. Snow kept falling slow and lazy, catching the last rays of the sun before they disappeared behind the ridge. I picked up the phone again, opened the message, and typed nothing. Just watched the blinking cursor for a few seconds before pressing delete. Then I turned the phone face down on the table. My hand shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of choice. The kind of choice that feels like loss even when it's freedom. The silence that followed was soft, almost gentle. I walked back to the window, the mountains glowing amber in the dying light. My reflection merged with the view. The golden villa behind me, the endless white before me. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a duty. It was an option. And sometimes the kindest thing you can give someone is your absence. The sun dipped below the ridge, scattering its last warmth across the snow. For a brief, breathtaking second, everything glowed. Roof trees, mountains, all bathed in light that looked like it might never fade. I stood there breathing it in, feeling the quiet settle deep in my bones. The house exhaled with me, the wind threading through the open window carrying the scent of pine and snow. And as the final light slipped away, I understood something simple, something my mother never did. Peace doesn't arrive when the noise stops. It arrives when you stop letting it in. The first light of morning spilled through the curtains, pale and soft, turning the frost outside into tiny mirrors. The snow that had blanketed the deck for months was finally melting water, dripping rhythmically from the railing, each droplet catching the sun before it fell. The sound was steady, patient, like the heartbeat of the house. I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the chipped one, with the faint outline of a mountain on it, and stood by the kitchen window as steam curled upward. The smell of roasted beans mixed with pine and cold air seeping in through the frame. For once, I didn't rush to start the day. I just breathed it in. The house was quiet, in a way that wasn't empty anymore. It was full of little sounds. The creak of wood expanding in the morning warmth, the kettle clicking as it cooled the faint hum of the heater. On my desk near the window sat a new sketch, the lines still rough graphite smudged along the edges of my fingers. Aurora Women's Shelter. The name felt right. Strong, simple, full of light. I adjusted the layout slightly, shading in the curve of a roofline, softening the edges of a courtyard. The design wasn't for me. It was for women like me, women who had spent too long mistaking control for love, who needed a place that whispered, "You're safe here." As I drew, sunlight crept across the desk, illuminating the faint pencil marks. The coffee stains, the notes scrawled in the margins. I smiled. I once fought to keep a house that made me feel trapped. I murmured to the empty room. Now I build homes for people who need to be free. Outside, the mountains glowed under the new sun. I slipped on my coat and stepped out into the morning air. The snow underfoot was melting fast, giving way to dark soil, and the first hint of green beneath it. My lavender pots, half buried for months, were visible again. I knelt beside them, loosening the frozen soil, brushing away brittle stems, pressing new roots into place. The scent rose faintly sharp and clean, blending with the mountain wind. Each movement felt deliberate, unhurried. My hands were cold, but my chest was warm. The kind of warmth that doesn't come from fire, but from calm. I stood and looked out over the valley. The sky was impossibly wide, streaked with gold and silver clouds. Somewhere below, a river cut through the snowfield, invisible but alive, the sound faint and steady. People always said family ties can't be broken, that blood is everything. Maybe that's true for some, but sometimes survival means cutting the cord that strangles you. Sometimes love means walking away and choosing peace over history. Back inside the house glowed in the morning light. I picked up the picture frame from the shelf, the one photo I hadn't been able to throw away. It showed us years ago before things cracked open. Mom smiling too wide, Lauren holding a toddler on her hip. Me standing awkwardly between them, half turned, half gone. Even then, I looked at it for a long time before flipping it face down. The sound was soft final. Then I opened the drawer of my desk, placed the frame inside, and turned the key until it clicked. On the wall behind me hung a different picture now. One I'd taken myself. The villa after the first snowfall light pouring through the windows. Untouched whole. It wasn't about perfection. It was about peace. I sat back down, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and stared out at the horizon. The world outside was bright, but quiet, like it had finally exhaled. They said I turned my back on family. But that wasn't true. I only turned away from pain. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and opened every window in the house. The cold air swept through, lifting the curtains, carrying away the last trace of old ghosts. The scent of lavender drifted in from the porch, mixing with sunlight and melting snow. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang, breaking the silence just long enough to remind me I was still here. For a moment, I just stood there, breathing the light, touching everything. The furniture, the walls, the floor beneath my bare feet. The house didn't feel like a fortress anymore. It felt alive, breathing with me. Outside the mountains stood unmoving, vast and eternal. But I knew even they changed. Slowly, quietly over time. Just like me. If you've ever had to choose between peace and family, between what they demand and what your soul needs, remember this. Peace isn't betrayal. It's survival. And when the time comes to decide, choose yourself. Always